We ready?
You're good to go.
Hello, everyone. Again, it has been a very good start. We're so happy with the sessions and the plenary we had. And this time, our specialist is Dr. Paul Kate Matsuda. It's a great honor for me to introduce a professor, a professional who inspired me when I was writing my dissertation. So Dr. Paul Kate Matsuda is professor of English and director of second language writing at Arizona State University, where he works closely with doctoral students specializing in second language writing from various disciplinary perspectives. Dr. Matsuda is founding chair of Symposium of Second Language Writing and series editor of the Porter Press series on second language writing. Former president of the American Association of Applied Linguistics, he has also served as the founding chair of the 4Cs Committee on Second Language Writing and the chair of the non-native English speakers in TESOL and NNEST at TESOL International Association. Dr. Matsuda has published widely in applied linguistics, writing studies, and TESOL, and has received a number of prestigious awards for his publications. He uses a diverse array of theoretical and methodological tools to investigate topics such as disciplinary history, identity and written discourse, professional development, writing for publication, writing and language assessment, teaching and learning, and writing program administration. It's a great honor to have Dr. Paul Kate Matsuda with us. After like 20 years, we've been inviting him. We have such a great honor, Dr. Matsuda, to have you at our conference here in Honduras. And hopefully, we will see you in one of our conferences in the future. And we're going to have you face-to-face, live with you in those particular rooms. And welcome to our conference. And the floor is all yours.
Great. Thank you, Gloria, for your wonderful introduction. Hi, everyone. My name is Paul K. Matsuda, and I'm really happy to be here with you today. Can you all see my PowerPoint screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. So I'm going to try to make this talk appealing to a wide variety of people, not just people who are teaching L2 writing. And instead of giving you my thoughts on what should be done in the post-pandemic context, I'm going to lay the context for a discussion and then have you ask specific questions that you are facing in the post-pandemic situation. So the term post-pandemic is not something that I like because this pandemic started very slowly and everybody started talking about what happens after the pandemic, but that after the pandemic didn't arrive for a few years. And we have all been exhausted by the situation. And everybody's ideas about post-pandemic is very different. There's no unified post-pandemic era, so to speak. But instead, what we have is challenges that are not necessarily related to the pandemic itself. And so I think of post-pandemic not so much as something that happens after the pandemic, but coming back to a situation with the wisdom and awareness that we developed during the pandemic era. And just to look at how the word post-pandemic has been used, I used Google's Ngram to see the frequency of this term. And as it turns out, this term didn't come into existence until around the 1920s and the 1920s, starting with the first flu pandemic. And then it has come back time after time with every pandemic that we have experienced over the last 100 years. And we are currently experiencing, or we have just experienced, the latest and the greatest pandemic of all in our memory, recent memory. And even though the pandemic itself, or the seed of the pandemic, that is COVID-19, started in 2019, most of us started experiencing this pandemic in the 2020. The first time I saw this term, coronavirus, was in January of 2020. And it was through a meme that was being circulated on Facebook. And at that time, I was traveling in Egypt, giving a lecture and workshop at a conference in Egypt. And on my way back from Egypt, I stopped in Thailand and gave another lecture at Thailand TESOL. And that year, I had many conference presentations, plenary talks, invited lectures scheduled throughout the year. And that year was supposed to be a really busy year for me professionally, because I was planning to organize 2 international conferences, one in Turkey and one in Indonesia. But then when I came home, I realized that this coronavirus was a much bigger deal than I had imagined. And one of the first things that hit me was the cancellation of many academic events. Now, when I heard this news, many of the conferences that I was associated with, such as TESOL, the American Association for Applied Linguistics, and other language conferences, were not canceled yet. But my intuition told me that this was going to go on for a while. So I immediately called off the Symposium on Second Language Writing, the conference that I have been organizing since 1918. And I called off this conference and refunded all the registration and canceled all the arrangements. And at the same time, I had to cancel all the flights and hotels and many arrangements that I had made with various organizations and universities. And that took me a few weeks. And so it kept me busy. And when I was done with that enormous task of canceling everything, I was exhausted and depressed and didn't feel like doing anything. Another meme that was going around at that time was this one, 2020, written by Stephen King and directed by Quentin Tarantino, soundtrack by Yoko Ono. If you know Stephen King, the horror story writer, and Quentin Tarantino, the movie director, their work, you probably know what it feels like. It's out of the world, depressing, scary situation. And so since I wasn't able to go out and I wasn't able to interact with people directly, I spent much time staying at home, and the only connection with people was through social media. So a lot of information was coming to me through memes like this one. Today's drink special, the quarantini. It's just a regular martini, but you drink it alone in your house. And that's exactly what I did. And since I had a lot of time to spare, I started creating pictures and new icons for my social media and wasting a lot of time. And I didn't feel like working. I didn't feel like writing. I didn't feel like doing anything professionally. I was just drained. And many of you probably experienced this during this period. And to get out of that situation, many of us started trying to motivate ourselves. And at that time, my motto was do one thing each day. So I slept a lot and I didn't even feel like eating, but I decided I'm going to spend some time doing one thing. And that one thing might be just cooking a meal and eating and then going back to sleep. But as time went by, it seemed that the pandemic wasn't ending. So I spent more time cooking. A lot of people picked up pandemic hobbies and practiced a lot. So we all became better at something other than what we normally do, like teaching or doing research. And I also started watching a lot more movies. I subscribed to some streaming services so that I can entertain myself while staying at home. And in order to maintain friendship and connections that we all craved, we started having meetings with friends online, not for professional purposes, just to touch base and share what's going on in our lives. But some people gradually started becoming more productive and seeing ways of motivating ourselves. And this was one of the memes that I found. This was created by yoga school. And at the beginning of the pandemic, we were afraid of the situation. So many people went panic shopping or felt angry or afraid or depressed and irritated and so on. And then we started seeing different possibilities, moving from fear zone to learning zone. So we started seeing our understanding our own emotions better and evaluating information before acting on something, or recognizing that everybody is trying to make things better in their own ways, even though we don't agree with each other. And then people started doing something more productive in their lives, given the unusual circumstances that we didn't know when it was going to end. So my attempt to cope with the situation and to do something productive was to create a webinar. I had never created or organized or presented a webinar before, but I thought this is something worthwhile in order to keep the community connected and give people some intellectual stimulation, professional development opportunities that weren't available because of canceled conferences and so on. And one of the topics, of course, was the challenges of remote teaching. And I wasn't an expert on remote teaching, but I learned a lot during the pandemic and enough to facilitate discussion. The emphasis was not so much to teach people what to do, but more to share experiences, to explore ideas, and so that we can cope with the current situation. And if you are interested, the webinar series, I think I did 4 of them, 3 of them total, no, 4 of them. And they are available on YouTube. So, and you can search for the Symposium on Second Language Writing there. And in the meantime, the COVID case was getting worse and worse. And in various countries, the timing was different, but situation was getting worse and worse. The death toll was climbing and we didn't know when it was going to end. And there were some funny attempts to look at the situation, and this is one of them. That trajectory looks like something that we learned in math classes, exponential functions, that we never thought we would be using in our real lives, daily lives. But that became something that everybody thought about when we woke up and saw the news. And also, because of the frustration and people didn't know what to do, who to blame. So people started looking for something that they can blame on. And so this meme was going around, upset when people call it the Chinese virus. That's cute. Making fun of people who are saying, don't call it Chinese virus, call it COVID-19. And the next slide is going to show you some pictures, a picture that may not make some people uncomfortable. So if you are not comfortable with seeing blood or injury, please close your eyes. And this was another news that was going around. Racist attacks against agents continue to rise as the coronavirus threat grows. And I felt compelled to spread this news and also spread the information about why calling it Chinese virus is not a good idea. In fact, one of my first experiences with coronavirus was when I went to Egypt. I was going through the passport control at the airport, and the person who was checking the passport had his mask on his chin. I wasn't wearing my mask, and he was just dealing with everybody one by one. But the moment he saw his face, he moved the mask up and covered his face. And that was a very subtle and action, but I felt it. And other actions that people took wasn't that subtle. And I continued to be creative, trying to spread good information and creating memes. And I had never created memes in the past, but I learned how to do it and I had fun with it. Right? We acquired new skills in the technological environment out of necessity and because we had the time and resources. And I also created a video promoting the use of masks. And also the US State Department, the English language programs, asked me to create a video of hand washing just to spread good practices, hygiene practices during the time of pandemic. But at the same time, some well-intended messages were turned out to be false. And there were also lots of conspiracy theories and myths regarding coronavirus. And some people even said it doesn't exist. It's fake, or it's a conspiracy to keep people indoors to serve some political purposes. So many social media tried to regulate the false information by fact-checking. And another initiative was there were some conferences that were taking place despite the coronavirus. Different countries had different situations. So in Korea, Asia TEFL conference was happening in a hybrid format. And they asked me to be a plenary speaker and present myself as a hologram. So I had to go to Los Angeles to a special studio and have myself filmed in the 3D format. And I presented that plenary in this format. This is not real me. This is just a hologram. I'm not that big. And when I visited Los Angeles, one of my former students and a friend invited me to give a lecture, but not in person. So we social distanced in a room with the host, and the actual session was being presented online. And again, many of you, or all of us, went through that experience at various times. And it looked as though, and everybody was hoping that after this summer, the pandemic will be over. After this year, the pandemic will be over. but it didn't seem like there was no end in sight. 1 year later, we've tried many different things, but it kept going on, and everybody was being exhausted, frustrated, didn't know what to do. And some of us even felt useless, like UE in the word Q. And one of the TV shows that I was watching from Korea was about it's okay not to be okay. I think that the title was something like that. And that message happened to be an appropriate one at the time of the pandemic. And the government, US government, was encouraging, and local governments were encouraging people to go outside, exercise, in order to stay, in order not to be depressed or to compromise health in other ways. And one of the activities that some people took on was motorcycle riding. And I had just begun riding motorcycles before the pandemic. So I started doing that during the pandemic. And I practiced a lot and I got a little better and I had so much fun. And I also enjoyed reflecting on how I was learning new skills, which resonated with how students learn a language. So I wanted to learn more about how teaching and learning can be accomplished in other contexts. So I became a motorcycle riding instructor. And as a result of that experience, I actually became a much better teacher and much more analytical about every little detail of my teaching. And I can share some experience maybe later during the question and answer session. And during this period, most of the conference presentations were happening online. And I was craving human contact. I wanted to see people, feel how they respond, how they communicate in the same room. But that was something that was not allowed at that time. And many of us probably experienced the video call fatigue, having Zoom meetings all the time, conferences all the time, online all the time. And I was really getting sick of it as well. And in August 2021, everybody thought that we could start having in-person classes in the fall semester in North America. But as soon as the semester started, many universities started canceling in-person classes and switched back to online modes. Another frustrating moments during the pandemic. And ASU also, ASU was having classes in hybrid format with the masks required initially. And the university provided hand sanitizers, masks, thermometers, and other amenities and called it Community of Care Kit. And the department meeting, annual department meeting was held online. And this was probably one of the only times when I liked being online and not having to come to campus for meetings. And I secretly wished that even after the pandemic, department meeting will continue to be held online. And 2020 arrived. And by this time, I was starting to travel, but not for professional purposes, because the conferences were still online. So I was not getting any invitations. Most of the all of the invitations were for online meetings. But because I'm a scuba diver and scuba diver instructor as well, I started traveling for scuba diving purposes. And when I told people about my trips, some people invited me to come and give lectures and workshops in context where in-person meetings on a smaller scale were beginning to happen. But at this point, the meetings were still many of the meetings were still online as well. And finally, 2023 came. And by that point, ASU was fully on in person. And many of the conferences are becoming in person again. And some people expected smaller turnout, but as it turns out, many people were craving in-person conferences, the human contact, rather than being constrained by the online conference environment. And I'm so happy to hear that this conference next year is going to be in person rather than online. I'm really looking forward to that as well. So, and invitations started coming back for in-person conferences. So I started traveling again, not as frequently as I used to travel. Before the pandemic, I was traveling half of the year to give lectures and workshops. But now I'm traveling less frequently, but I have had a chance to meet some of my old colleagues, new people, and Dudley Reynolds, the other plenary speaker, when I visited Qatar. And a happy ending to this pandemic story was that I was able to visit Egypt again at the end to mark the end of the pandemic for scuba diving. And another happy news is that the conference, my conference, the Symposium on Second Language Writing, was canceled in 2020, and I didn't want to hold it online because there were many online conferences and people are already exhausted with online conferences. So I decided to hold off until it was relatively safe to start. And this January, I felt that the time has finally come and decided to organize the conference this year in October. And following my decision, my intuition turned out to be right again. The official health organizations started recognizing the end of COVID-19 pandemic. And many organizations, the testing was being discontinued except in certain circumstances. And Johns Hopkins University, which had been keeping a pretty good record of the test results as well as death toll, stopped collecting data in March. And by May, WHO and Center for Disease Control in the US declared the pandemic on the end of COVID-19 pandemic. But so these are some of the statistics from major countries where pandemic was rampant. And Honduras also suffered significantly, especially during the first part of the pandemic. And as you can see, the cases didn't completely disappear. It's coming back in many different countries, but in less significant forms. Now, where are the lessons in this story? So one of the things that we learned during this process was that nothing is permanent, nothing is certain. And when in times of difficulty, we have to be flexible and we have to be patient. If we weren't able to meet in person, we had to find some other ways of teaching. And if certain resources were not available, we needed to create a way of communicating better and learn how to adapt to new situations, which most of us or all of us did during this process.
De mariquitas, por favor. Enciéndame la luz de aquí.
And another change, because we were constrained by, we weren't able to go out and meet people face to face, we learned to use technology. Dudley Reynolds, earlier this afternoon, mentioned how we have all learned to use Zoom proficiently. At the beginning, it was a struggle for many people, but by now, it's as natural as walking into a classroom and starting an in-person class. And because we relied so much on technology, we have also developed the capability to create and consume multimodal texts. And at the same time, in the field of second language writing and in education, people are beginning to notice and recognize the importance of multimodality and multimodal communication in our lives and in our educational context. So that's another evolving topic and issue that needs to be addressed in the post-pandemic situation. But the pandemic actually helped us become more adept at using multimodal resources. And the spread of false information has necessitated the critical evaluation of information. Now, as a writing teacher, this is something that I've always taught. When students cited sources, I always challenged students to think about whether the source was credible and whether that source was the best source for the purpose. So critical thinking is an important part of education, including language education. But many people experience this in more vivid and personal ways during the pandemic. And because of the ups and downs emotionally and professionally that we experienced, we have become much more aware of the need for self-care, not just for ourselves, but for our students. I think I have become much more sympathetic as a teacher, and I'm making more adjustments to meet student needs than ever before. And paying attention to our own and students' emotional needs has also become an important part of what we do as professionals. And at the same time, in the field of language studies, there has been an increased attention to the role of emotions in language learning and language teaching. So many of the hot topics in the field also coincided with some of the experience that were created by the COVID-19 pandemic. And because of the stress and also because we weren't able to focus so much on our work as we used to, some of us were forced to create a better work-life balance. And some of us chose to create that balance. Before the pandemic, I couldn't say I had a life. I was spending most of my time in the professional context and took only limited time off in order to enjoy life. But during the pandemic, I cooked more and I started riding motorcycle more or diving more. And I think I have found more of a work-life balance that's healthier than before the pandemic. And as we learn to do new things, play musical instruments, cooking, flower arrangements, motorcycle riding, swimming, the new activities that people took on, we learned new skills. And in that process, we probably also learned how to learn. And that's an eye-opening and refreshing experience for teachers because we spend so much time teaching other people, but having learned a new skills during the pandemic helped all of us become much more aware of what kind of struggles students go through as they try to learn. And that probably made us better teachers than ever before. And in all of these experiences and situations, being reflective, being aware was crucially important in order to cope with the situation, to adapt to the new situation, and to develop new skills so that we can continue to function even during difficult situations. And as we are coming out of the pandemic, we are now beginning to find renewed sense of purpose. And if we haven't found one, we need to look for it seriously in order to keep going and in order to get back into the life that's facing us. And so the post-COVID pedagogy in the most general terms are going to be flexible because we have learned to be more flexible. When something changes, We don't get upset easily, but we understand the situation, find resources, and put together our answers. And sometimes we need to learn new skills in order to perform under a new circumstance. And because we have learned how to use online communication tools to create memes or video, I used to hate video. I wasn't very good at it. But during the pandemic, I learned and became more comfortable with video conferencing as well as creating video to be shared with other people. And those skills are going to carry over to our teaching, and we can integrate technology more proficiently in every aspect of teaching. And coincidentally, the end of the pandemic also coincided with the dawn of AI pedagogy. Last November, ChatGPT, which was the topic of the earlier plenary session, became a big news. And now everybody's scrambling to figure out what to do about this situation. And I'd be happy to share some of my insights and experience as well, and engaging conversations with you in a few moments. And multimodality is also going to be really important in students' lives, because when students go into professional contexts, their lives, their work is not going to be just using traditional writing mode or speaking, but they're going to have to use images, video, and various other sources or resources, multimodal resources, in order to function properly. And so as teachers, we can't just focus on language. Even though we are language teachers, we need to understand and help students understand and develop the ability to integrate various language and visual and sound and other resources in order to develop their communication. And as teachers, I think we should continue to be sensitive to our students' needs and adapt to new situations. And finally, one thing I haven't mentioned about the changes that became necessary as a result of the COVID pandemic was that because of the limited resources and because of the transition into the online situation, and because students and teachers were not used to the situation, we became more realistic about what can be accomplished. I used to have a very high expectation for myself and for my students, but the pandemic taught me to be more realistic about what can be accomplished at various levels. And this realization also came from teaching motorcycle and scuba diving, because not everybody is highly proficient from the beginning or comfortable from the beginning. And so what each individual can accomplish is going to be highly variable. And we need to understand that. And when we are teaching something complicated like writing, academic writing, professional writing, and multimodal text production, we need to be realistic about what students can be reasonably expected to accomplish. Just a few weeks ago, I think it was in Malaysia, one of the teachers told me that students don't like writing and the teachers don't like writing. And I said, that's exactly right. And the reason is, when it comes to writing, we tend to expect too much too soon. When students are learning to speak, and if they make mistakes, if they have errors, we don't expect them to correct everything from the beginning. If they can speak up and if they can communicate, that's a good start. We recognize that. But for some reason, when we teach writing, we don't give that kind of room for growth to students. Instead, we expect students to write well organized and well formed sentences from the beginning, and we end up punishing students for experimenting with their language, which is actually counterproductive for language learning. And this is another important topic in second language writing, the role of corrective feedback and how we have been paying too much attention to corrective feedback and not paying enough attention to how students actually develop. And that's another topic I'd be happy to discuss during the question and answer session. And just to share my thoughts, my take on teaching with AI, here are some of the basic guidelines that I have for teachers who are relatively inexperienced with teaching with AI or other forms of technology. First off, I would acknowledge the existence of AI and not ignore it because it's not going to go away. And I wouldn't prohibit the use of AI because if I tell students not to do something, what are they going to do? They're going to do it anyway and not tell me about it. And then I would be losing the opportunity to help students become better and more critical users of AI tools and other tools. And as teachers, we need to constantly learn about the reality of language and language use and language production that students are experiencing and the tools that are available to us. So learning about AI and AI tools is an important mission as for teachers moving forward. And at the same time, we need to promote an accurate understanding of AI and AI tools among students and the public. And we need to be aware of and discuss strengths and weaknesses of AI and each tool. They are not perfect and they can do harm. And not all tools are equally effective in different situations. And discussing appropriate and inappropriate uses of AI tools is what's really important. And this principle also applies to text borrowing. There are appropriate forms of text borrowing for learning and language production, and there are inappropriate forms of text borrowing. We can say the same thing about AI. So if we prohibit students from using it, we lose the opportunity to teach this important principle. And we need to, in any given assignment, we need to specify how AI can or cannot be used for each task. If we are trying to promote fluency and having students write for 5 minutes, using AI is going to defeat the purpose. So in that situation, I would tell students it's not appropriate to use AI to generate the text. But I would tell students that after generating the text, after practicing, if you want to get feedback, you can use AI to provide suggestions or show how it can be revised for the better. And using specific learning objectives and discussing how AI can facilitate or interfere with the objective, which is related to the previous point, is also important. And this requires us to be more aware of our course objectives, as well as unit objectives and objectives of specific tasks that we assign to students. And that's something that we should have always done, but some of us have gotten so used to teaching that we weren't really thinking about the objectives each time. And that was another thing that I became more aware of as a result of during the pandemic, especially when I was teaching diving and motorcycle riding. In fact, in both teaching motorcycle and scuba diving, instructors are supposed to state verbatim the objectives for each exercise or each activity before demonstrating how to do it. And finally, we need to teach the effective uses of AI so that students can continue to use it appropriately and ethically and effectively in order to accomplish their learning and communicative goals. So, what's post-COVID situation? Is it back to normal or is it the new normal? people tend to be polarized about this question, but I think the answer is somewhere in the middle. What we need is the critical appraisal of old practices and principled integration of new practices that we began to develop during the pandemic. The pandemic has created an opportunity to critically evaluate the status quo and to explore new possibilities. Let's capitalize on that as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Matsuda. Definitely, we were remembering dark moment. And the question arises, should we go back to a new normal or go back to the old normal? And I loved your conclusion that the answer lies somewhere in the middle. In previous presentations, and I think it was in the first plenary, Mr. Miguel Paz asked a question about writing, and it's resonating. He asked if it was convenient to have writing practices in the classroom and chunk it in sections that would be given feedback of constantly and progressively, or if it was better to assign writing as homework, as project, and then check. So when we were explaining about the corrective nature that we think that writing has, I was thinking about that question, and with Mr. Miguel Paz's permission, I'm re-asking the question to see what your perspective on it is.
Yeah, that's a really good question.
Uh-huh.
So with this question, the answer is also somewhere in the middle. It doesn't have to be either or. There are kinds of tasks, depending on the learning objectives, that are more effective if the writing takes place in class. And there are situations where taking the time to craft their writing and presenting them in class, crafting them outside of the class and presenting them inside the class is more productive. So at the beginning, when I introduce writing tasks, I might ask students to do preliminary writing, brainstorming, drafting in the classroom, so that I can troubleshoot as students struggle with certain aspects of writing. And I can also have students reflect on the process so that I can provide appropriate tips and strategies that students can use in order to complete the assignment successfully. And for collaborative writing, one of the key aspects of collaborative writing is to have students write together equally and be involved in the entire process, rather than separating the task into different components. And because if students said, I'm going to write the introduction, you write the middle, and you write the end. If they did that, it's not collaborative. It's individual writing put together, right? So it's important to get students started in the classroom so that they can actually learn how to collaborate more productively by offering suggestions, thinking together, and providing feedback as they go along. And once they have started in writing in that context, they can now go off and work on their projects, but they have already experienced how to do it. And we have had a chance to coach them how to collaborate effectively, right? So the writing in the outside of the classroom is more likely to be effective than if we just sent them off to write on their own.
Perfect. There's a debate all the time about Frankenstein's monster, that his name is not Frankenstein, it's the doctor's last name. but we call it a Frankenstein when we get this writing, collaborative writing that hasn't been collaborative at all, and we call it Frankenstein because it has many different parts that come from different perspectives and have no cohesion at all. Okay, I was also thinking about the artificial intelligence component, how to control, because this is a common question all the time. I'm sure you're used to it. How to is it by making writing more personal and more meaningful and more context adapted that we can avoid those tools getting in the way?
Well, the tools can be used in any context. So even if the assignment is meaningful, if students want to use it, they can. And we can use the tools depending on how we use it in order to facilitate the completion of particular tasks. So it's not dependent on the nature of the task itself. So a productive question to ask in this context is, what are the effective ways of integrating technology? So, the easy answer that students and teachers think of is to ask ChatGPT to generate the text, right? Write this essay for me, write this letter of recommendation for me. And here are some of the parameters, right? The details, the name and the institution. And that's not an appropriate use of AI for a writing assignment. But if students wanted to get learn the criteria for effective letters of recommendation, they can ask ChatGPT, what does a good letter of recommendation look like? And then ChatGPT can produce the criteria that students can use in order to produce their own text. And then they can feed their own text back and say, hey, ChatGPT, using the criteria that you just gave me, can you evaluate this paper? And then they can get the assessment of the quality of the writing, as well as much more detailed and comprehensive feedback than a human teacher can provide, especially when we have 40 students, 50 students in the classroom. Right?
Definitely.
So instead of doing all the work for the students, we are offloading the learning process to students. In the writing assessment community, we call this assessment as learning. In the process of engaging in the assessment, students identify and internalize the criteria. And once they internalize the criteria, and once they match the criteria and the actual text that they produce or that they read, students will develop the ability to transfer those analytical skills that can help them in future writing tasks.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Dr. Matsuda. It's clear now that these tools are friends into the classroom, and we have to lead our students into using them on a how-to aid, a helper in getting me to understand how to write better, how to understand the structure of different types of writing better, instead of asking it to write it for me. We have to change our students' mindset. And we're the owners of our classroom, we're the owners of our learning space. So it all depends on our design of the lessons, our design of the course, our syllabus and plans, in order to think about the objectives that we want to accomplish. It was very enriching to listen to you go through this presentation. We invite you to our next conference in 2025, because we have the second biggest, largest coral reef barrier in Roatan. So if you're a scuba diver and an instructor, you'll be more than happy to join us in here.
I'll be there.
It's such an honor to interact with you, Dr. Matsuda. Thank you very much. See you in our next presentation.
Thank you.
Have a great evening. Thank you, everybody. See you in our next session.
Okay.
Go back to the sway.
Yeah,
and-
I see a question from Jenny, so I will stay here and respond to her before signing off. So if you can just keep this room open for now.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Right.
Can I read it before people disconnect? We have 1 minute.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, or I can answer it if I have 1
Okay,
minute.
go ahead. Yeah.
Right. So the question is, we are a training teacher university. How do we inspire students to learn through writing and be true to themselves? The first place that I can think of is to assign a writing task that is relevant and meaningful to students. And if we assign academic essays that has no reality in their own lives, it's probably not the most engaging assignment to start with. So I would start with something that they are already familiar with or something that they are more likely to use, like writing instructions for using some equipment in a room that they are familiar with, or writing an invitation to a guest speaker if they are going to be organizing a conference, or and so by making it more meaningful and realistic, I think students will engage better, and they will also be able to find their identity or their roles within the communicative context. A lot of times when we assign writing, we put students in the student role and then ask them to pretend that they are experts on topics that they are not expert in, right? So in order to have them develop a sense of authority and authorship, we need to actually have them write about something that they know, more than us readers, right? The teachers and other readers, so that they can actually play that author role.
Go through the real life application, definitely. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
In order to get to the academic and, formal writing. Beautiful. Thank you very much. Thank you, Thank you, Dr. Celaya, for your question. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Matsuda. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. See you. Have a great evening. See you in the next session. Goodbye.
Take care.
You too.